Good evening, everyone. Good evening. All right, don't let the weather get you down. We're going to have a good time this evening. I'm LaFontaine Oliver, and I have the absolute pleasure of serving this community as the president and CEO of New York Public Radio. And it is such a pleasure to be with you in the green space, which we like to think of as the physical manifestation of this organization's mission. It's a space to come together, to be inspired, be moved, and to ask big questions and look together for some solutions. Hopefully we're going to do a little bit of that this evening. But first, I'd like to take a moment to thank our members for your continued support. Do we have any members in the house? Can I see you? Can I see you? Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you to our members. It is not an exaggeration when I say that we could not do any of this without your support. None of it would be possible. So we are grateful for your membership and support. I'd also like to thank our Science Friday family and the Green Space team for helping bring tonight's program together and to bring it to life. And this is also made possible with the sponsorship from the Marine Stewardship Council. I met some wonderful folks from the Marine Stewardship Council just this evening. Thank you all for your support. So please take a moment to secure your umbrellas and your galoshes and silence your cell phones as we begin our program. The Green Space also announced recently our stellar lineup for this fall. On October 2nd, Morning Edition hosts Steve Inskeep and Michael Hill will discuss Steve Inskeep's new book about Abraham Lincoln's various encounters that shaped his political goals. You don't want to miss that, so please join us back here on October 2nd. And next, on October 4th, you may know him best as Ron from Parks and Recs, but he's also a New York Times best-selling author. Join us as Nick Offerman guest star on a live broadcast of All Things Considered, and he discusses his new book, which examines our relationship to nature and what the land means to the creatures who inhabit it. That's just a sneak preview of some of the wonderful stuff coming up here live in the green space. Get your tickets. You can also access our live streams at thegreenspace.org. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Diana, who's our producer for Science Friday, and she's going to get the program started. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for being here, everyone. My name is Diana Plasker. I am the Experiences Manager for Science Friday, which essentially means I design our events as well as our book club, which is part of the reason why you all are here tonight. So thank you again for being here. I'm not the only producer of this event, though. We partnered with Grist to make this event happen, and she's not joining us on stage, but Rachel Boughton is also the fellow producer for this event. So if we can just give her a round of applause. So if you don't know, Science Friday is your one-stop shop for all things science news. So if you listen to WNYC on a weekly basis, which hopefully a lot of you do, you can hear us on your airwaves 2 to 4 p.m. every Friday, bringing you all of the latest news with science. We are spending a whole Friday, this Friday, talking about climate change for Climate Week NYC. So you can join in and listen to some really great stories that we'll be telling you. But we don't just do a radio show. We do live events like you're here to see tonight. We have original videos, web articles, educational resources, all kinds of stuff. And you can find out more about us after the event at sciencefriday.com. Grist, our partner for this event, is an award-winning nonprofit news and media organization that's dedicated to telling the stories of climate solutions and a just future. So it probably makes sense to you hearing that, why Science Friday and Grist partnered together for this event. It was kind of a no-brainer when we started thinking about what we wanted to read together for our shared book clubs in September. So in 2021, Grist launched the Imagine 2200 Climate Fiction for Future Ancestors. It's a climate fiction writing contest that explores the power of imagination in creating a more just and sustainable future. The initiative invited writers from around the world to envision the next 150 years of equitable climate progress through fictional short stories. The results became a book, Afterglow, which you probably saw for sale in our lobby, and which you can find online and purchase for yourself to read afterwards. We're going to be talking a little bit about the book today and how it inspires sort of creative process through climate solutions. The book was published by the New Press. Thank you again for them for helping us sell those books in the lobby today. And you'll be hearing selected readings from the book tonight, so hopefully that will inspire you to read more of the stories in the future. So, like I said, as you can imagine, Science Friday and Grist coming together, it kind of started to make sense. So throughout this month, we have been reading the book together with our book clubs, and we are so excited to sort of continue the conversation here tonight with 4 really amazing people who will be talking about their practice, and we're going to bring them on in just a minute. Tonight's event will feature a panel conversation led by New York Times best-selling author and creative writing professor at Princeton University. Her name is Morgan Jerkins. We're going to be exploring the role that creativity and imagination play in helping society imagine a just, sustainable, and inclusive world for all people. Interspersed throughout the program, you'll hear live readings from Afterglow by Obie Award-winning Afrofuturist playwright and actor Eric Lockley. And we'll conclude by inviting you all to actually imagine for yourself. So that's what those notebooks on your chairs are actually for. So keep those handy, because at the end we're going to go through a visioning session. That was actually part of the process for making the stories in Afterglow. So you're kind of going through the process the same way that the authors did as well. So that's it. That's all I have to tell you all. So we have a few seats in the front, by the way, so there's 4 seats here. So if anyone wants to relocate to the front, you are very welcome to. We appreciate it very much. And if you will join me in welcoming our featured guest, as well as our moderator for this evening, Morgan Jerkins.
Hello, everyone. I hope I'm happy y'all are here. It's a really rainy evening, so I'm honored to be sharing the stage with this illustrious group of panelists, and I'm going to quickly read their bios. So first we have Aisha Shillingford. Aisha is an anti-disciplinary artist, world builder, designer, and cultural strategist originally from Trinidad and Tobago. She's an artist in residence at Laundromat Project's Creative Change Program, a mentor within the New Museum Incubator, and an inaugural fellow at the Race Forward Butterfly Lab for Immigrant Narrative Strategy. Thank you so much for being here with us, Aisha. Next, we have Tori Stevens, is the climate fiction creative manager at Grist, where he uses storytelling to champion climate justice and imagine green, clean, and just futures. Last, but certainly not least, Dr. Yoshira Ornelas Van Horn is an exposure scientist and environmental justice scholar. Currently, she's an assistant professor in the Department of Environmental Health Sciences at Columbia University Mailman School of Public Health. Say that 5 times fast. And she goes by Yoshi. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here this evening. So first, thank you. So first, I want to direct this question to Tori. So Grist focuses on real-world climate journalism and storytelling. And so why did you decide to focus on fiction with this initiative? Like, what role do you think fiction storytelling has to play in climate solutions?
Yeah, I guess I'll start with the first part. Grist picked up climate fiction because we were exploring alternative things that we wanted to do at Grist. We didn't know what that would be, so we convened a group of people we call fixers. We have a list called the Grist 50 list, which is like Forbes, the Forbes 50 list, but it's not focused on capitalism. It's focused on climate solution-focused individuals. And so we brought those folks together to have a really expansive discussion over dinner and talk about what would be exciting. Grist has been around for 20 plus years and, delivering news on climate, the climate crisis, when it was called global warming. And so we were just exploring what would be interesting to bring something new at Grist. And so we had folks break off into small groups and then come up and pitch what they thought. And someone brought up climate fiction. And I started to chew on that with some other folks at Grist, and we thought that would be really exciting. There was a lot of overlap, like, we have the editors, we have writers, we have the community of people that would be interested in this type of content. So we then convened others, and we did a visioning session where we explored, because the question I wanted to know, we can bring climate fiction, but what kind of climate fiction are we going to bring? We landed on climate fiction that's hopeful, full of climate solutions, decolonizing, intersectional, and culturally authentic. But thank you. But it took a while to get to that moment, that epiphany that said that's the type of climate fiction we want. And so the reason we got there, though, is because we brought folks together to have a visioning session on what that could look like. And when folks showed up, they brought all their beautiful selves to the table and said, we need to be talking about land back. We need to be talking about reparations. We need climate fiction that is where people's identity is not left out of the story. And so after that, I was kind of like, I was red-faced with excitement and like pretty much sold. And so then the idea was just pitching it inside Grist. And, I think after we workshopped it, people were really like, let's do this. So, yeah.
Yeah.
I think I missed the second part of your question, though.
No, it's okay. I think that was more than adequate. So Aisha, part of you being a multi-hyphenate person is you're a world builder, and so I want to know a bit about what is that process like, and does this particular process change when you're dealing with climate change solutions specifically, or you apply the same apparatus all around?
I think, world building is a literary process. Typically used by speculative fiction writers to really flesh out and make robust the story worlds within which their stories are happening. So typical worlds that we might be familiar with are like Star Wars, Star Trek, the Black Panther. It's worlds that don't, they're not the worlds that we're used to day to day, and they need to flesh them out so that when you watch those films or read those books, they feel real and they feel really deep and robust. And so people approach it a little bit differently depending on how different that world is from our current world, but it's essentially exploring the systems and structures and realities. Is there magic? Is there gravity in that world? Is it in the future? Who's in it? What are the values that govern that world? And if you think Star Trek is really, really good at world building because they touch on here's the values of that future world, here's who's in it, here's the degree of diversity we have, here's the technology that exists, the politics, and so on and so forth. I would say for climate world building, it's a little tougher than typical, because I think you're sort of dealing with, as time goes by, the question is, are you dealing with the climate change will not happen, or are you dealing with adaptation and mitigation? And I think increasingly you're dealing with okay, there might be a world in which climate change is occurring, and how do we explore the way we adapted to that reality, and then what can that adaptation teach us about what we need to do now?
Right. Yoshi, your work has been focused on public health, climate change, and community-driven research. What roles do creativity and hope play in your work?
Lately it's been playing a bigger role, mostly because mostly I like to say that I hate when science is boring, and a lot of people think that science is just in a lab, which sometimes it is. But the reason I went into public health is because I wanted to be out with people, right? I wanted to be able to incorporate their ways of knowing how the world is to them, and so creativity right now for me, I've been working a lot with youth. And so both youth out here in the South Bronx, and then youth out with indigenous youth out in South Dakota, and really building in for the kids that we're working out with in South Dakota. One of the projects that they wanted to work on was air pollution near the landfills there. But it actually didn't come from them saying we want to address air pollution. They came out and said, are we able to use the tires that are dumped here into different art projects? And I was like, well, that's a really good question. One, I'm not an artist. But second to that, they wanted to know if there was gases emitting off of them, right? And so then we were able to bring in one of their art teachers who sort of serve as their mentors and really pursue this question. And similarly, out in the South Bronx with the students there, we've been building air monitors that they themselves have been able to design and really test out into their community. They've gone out and recruited local businesses near their high school to set up these air monitors that they themselves envision, like, this is what I want it to look like, right? And so it incorporates many of these different pieces, both from these engineering Arduino boards that they're building, how do they actually get data out of these monitors, to building the piece into something that they actually enjoy and are making it so not as boring science, as I like to say, right? Yeah. And so that's sort of where a lot of these new pieces are being incorporated into my work, particularly because I really do think as the more we take down these walls or like vision who actually is a scientist, like I really want to instill in them that they are scientists already, and they don't need to have these like degrees in them or wait to have them to be able to call themselves scientists.
I love that. That makes for a great transition. We are going to turn to Afrofuturist playwright actor Eric Lockley now for the first of 3 readings from Afterglow, Climate Fiction for Future Ancestors. The following excerpt is from The Case of the Turned Tide by Savitri Horrigan. In this story, 2 detectives face an ethical dilemma as they solve a mystery for a corporate client with the power to improve the lives of millions.
My daughter must have been distracted, Mom continued, giving me the side eye. This is Plasker. He is head of the banjo for this town. He has graciously invited us to lunch with him and his husband, and then after, we can ask any questions we have. It's very nice to meet you, Plasker, I said as my cheeks flamed with embarrassment. You and your husband are very generous. Despite the hunger churning in my stomach, it was no excuse for my rudeness. He smirked knowingly and nodded toward the food, indicating that we should serve ourselves before joining him in the center of the pavilion. We joined Plasker and his husband, Plasker, on some faded but sturdy rattan chairs. As soon as they lifted a delicate handful of food to their mouths, I inhaled my gado and sagged in delight at its comforting texture and flavor. My dad's version would always be my favorite, but I loved how spicy Plakjendra's dish was, and how the local veggies he had used were crisper and sweeter than the ones in our town. He'd also added small, boiled rice patty snails that were delightfully chewy and combined well with the steamed rice cakes made from a red variety grown only in this region. Plakjendra grinned at me. I'm glad you like my cooking, he said, leaning into his husband with affection. You might already know that I source all of my food from this town and its surrounding area. This red rice is a source of pride for me in particular. Many years ago, Plasker said, we almost lost all our rice fields. If our crops weren't being ruined by scorching heat or flash floods, they were buried beneath landslides or ransacked by people fleeing sea-level towns and cities. Plakjendra's grin faded. It was a struggle to feed ourselves during that time, but we realized that by adapting our existing subak irrigation systems to fit the changing needs of our fields, we could mitigate at least some of the damage. We turned our temples into shelters for the houseless, who assisted our priest in measuring rain patterns so that we could predict the flow of water downhill and ensure that every rice paddy was equally fed. We banded together to advocate for policies in the decree that now offer stronger protections for our land and resources. Over time, conditions improved. And now we can rest, knowing that our grandchildren won't be hungry and that our cuisine can still be enjoyed by many. The food in my stomach turned to stone as the reality of his words sank in. He did not say it, but the gravity in his voice indicated that surviving this period had come at a huge physical and possibly spiritual cost. Mom pulled 3 sticks of incense made from recycled prayer flowers out of her bag and gave them to Plasker. This may not ease the pain for you, but sometimes it helps make it more bearable. If you want, we could light these and make an offering, she said. Plasker and Gendra accepted her incense, their faces tight masks of closed emotion. They produced some squares of woven pandan leaves filled with prayer flowers, and together we lit the incense and quietly honored the dead.
Thank you so much for that reading, Eric. I want to talk about this one striking quote in the excerpt that you just read. We turned our temples into shelters for the houseless. And I'm going to pose this question to all of you. Do we need to think critically about how to reappropriate existing infrastructure during a climate crisis?
Yes.
Well, I'm laughing a little bit because for people who live in New York, we know that we're running out. We have been repurposing infrastructure for new immigrants that are coming in, and many of them are fleeing the impacts of climate change. And so we are already doing that to the best of our ability, and we've run out of space apparently. So yes. Mm-hmm.
So obviously I would say yes, but I also want to point out the social justice aspect of this story, the idea that the story is focused on the houseless. I think that's a really core element of Imagine 2200 and the stories that we want to be telling. There's some other elements that are there where the rice paddies and the rice fields had been destroyed and they mitigated and changed the infrastructure. I think that's important to show the climate solutions and how they reacted. But since we're talking about New York, I think a lot of people have been talking about the empty buildings that are here. Those buildings could be used for, I don't see a lot of that coming back. In one way that we could be using it is, for folks that are fleeing climate emergencies in their country, but also for folks that are, threatened by many different, oppressive policies and things that are happening in our society. So I think, we can think about climate, but also just like how other folks are being left out in the cold.
Yeah, I think, you're right. Particularly here for New York City, if we think about how in the middle of like heat waves, right, like cooling centers and these different buildings are sort of repurposed in the middle of the day for exactly this, right, like helping people live through the heat, heat waves, cold storms, snowstorms, any of those. The other piece of the story that I particularly really took with it was the second part, the sentence that follows that about the priest actually collected the data to predict future floods, because that's sort of, I think, some of the questions we get or I get is like, what is community-driven research? But that is similar to that, right? That is a method. Like the priests are part of the community, not necessarily someone you would think of as like a scientist or being integrated into science, but they are in this story very much critical to the data needs that they were doing for this prediction of in the story that is going to help them with their new models, right? And so I think that is another part of the social justice, but also integrating science and community well-being into maximizing resources.
So I wanted to ask you a question about going back to what you were saying earlier about the indigenous children in South Dakota, were they indigenous? Or
Yeah.
And how they wanted to reappropriate tires into art projects, and you wanted them to start thinking about themselves as scientists now. Do you think that community-driven research is the future of science?
I mean, I like to believe so, mostly because a lot of, I think of, or at least in my work, a lot of what I see in my work, again, focuses more on this environmental justice lens. The stories or impacts that communities have felt, their stories precede usually a lot of this data we get, right? Like we know people when they tell us like, this is how I'm surviving heat, this is how I'm surviving the cold, I'm feeling the impact of this, or I live next to a smelter or oil companies or something. You hear their stories about how their skin is itching, how their eyes are always watery, how they can't breathe. But usually science is a little bit behind in catching up to that reality, mostly because there's a lack of data. And it's not until a few years later when we are able to design these rigorous studies or collect enough information that we sort of come back and say, actually, yeah, you living close to an oil well and Los Angeles is associated with you having reduced lung capacity, right? You being able to breathe less, your children being born lower birth weight, right? But that reality is something that the community already had identified, right? And then it's through their questions, them trying to get answer to those questions that a lot of these scientific questions and scientific studies then end up coming about.
Tori, this is your third year of leading Imagine 2200. I keep wanting to say 2100. That's not it. How has the experience been so far? Like, tell us a little bit about what it's like leading this really imaginative and propulsive project.
Yeah, I guess I'll start with just the idea of like people sitting and writing stories that are focused on hope and creating characters that are rich and dynamic and very layered. I think that part is always something that's really exciting. And the fact that we are getting stories from Indonesia and like other countries, you know, we really want this to not just be something that is focused on the United States. Want this project to kind of live in the world. Really want the global South to show up in these stories, and happy that that's been happening. And the other big thing is just, I've been in touch with these like creative people that like writers of all stripes has really, just for me personally, like reading those stories like gives me a lot of hope, right? So there's a lot of stories that don't make it to the 12 that end up in the book, but there's a lot of people who write to us and say, hey, I write dystopian stories and I've been doing that for a long time. That's like my second hand, you know? And I wrote my first hopeful story about climate. And, you know, that kind of like keeps me renewed, and it's just something that like, that's the reason we do this, you know? Yeah, I guess like that for me is like the big thing.
And didn't you say one of the writers featured in this program, that was their first time writing a short story, or first time?
Yeah, so one of the excerpts that were that's going to be read later is from a story called Broken from the Colony. And Ada, who is a trans femme woman, is a artist, like a contemporary artist, but had never submitted something written, you know, to any publication. And this is the first time that they had done that. They wrote about things that are very deeply personal to their identity. And they came, like, they were number 4. It was like, it's an amazing story. And like, it was republished in another magazine. And I just think that's amazing. And like, Ada couldn't talk about some of these things with her community members or her family, but, you know, mustered the bravery, because I think it's very brave to do such a thing, to submit a story that very much is about her own identity. So yeah, those kind of moments too. Like I think about how Dave Chappelle has kind of gone after this community and like, you know, made fun of like their identity, and you know, Ada's flipped it on her head and, you know, celebrated her own identity and brought joy into the project and like maybe paved a way for someone else. So I don't know, there's a lot of bravery there, and if you get a chance to read that story, you'll see what I'm talking about, and you'll hear a little bit too.
I'm excited for it. Aisha, let's say there are a few people in the audience who are trying to imagine a future in order to bring that into reality, but they have no idea where to start. What type of strategies would you offer them?
Well, we'll do a little bit of that later, but I would say one thing that has been taught to me by one of my teachers is to try to imagine the world that you desire for future generations, whether it's your own descendants through blood or people who you imagine living where you live or in a place that you could impact, 100, 200 years from now. What world would you want for them to live in? Like when I did my undergrad in environmental analysis and policy, back when we talked about sustainability, and we would talk about it being like, sustainability is the, sort of using resources now in a way that leaves resources for future generations or what have you. And I think that was the late 90s. We're sort of losing our capacity to think about future generations, and that's kind of a civilizational problem. So I think it's, we also learned that it's sort of our genetic imperative to make sure our species at least survives, and part of that is thinking about what world we want for future generations, and maybe even starting to think about them a little bit ahead of our own right now.
So I have a question to all of you, and I'll play it up. So last year, I was at the Bread Loaf Environmental Writers Conference. I was a faculty member there, and we were talking about climate change, and I asked the class, I said to them, okay, so what's something that is an obsession of yours, like a certain subcomponent of climate change that you're interested in? And one Black woman in the class said, I'm nervous about the Mississippi River drying up, but I am interested in the amount of Black history that will be uncovered once some of that water recedes. And so I wanted to pose the question to all of you: what is a subcomponent, or you can choose one or multiple of them, that keeps you up at night, or keeps you motivated, keeps you inspired, or something that just you cannot understand fully? I know that's really broad, but yeah.
Well, I don't know. A lot of things keep me up at night. I think for me lately, and this is sort of in line with some of the new research or area of research I'm going into, is I study really sad things, right? I study people that are exposed to metals, pesticides, and how this affects people's health. And lately, what I sort of started thinking about this like 9+ years ago. But I started seeing this sort of pattern, right? Particularly for communities that are impacted by these extractive industries, and thinking about, okay, we have a win here, right? Maybe some community was able to stop them. And then maybe another community was able to also win their case. But thinking more broadly, it really started eating at me of thinking, how can this win for this community be replicated across, right? And so sort of the stuff that I'm trying to look at now is really understanding what does justice mean to communities? And with that, are these settlements or reparations, particularly environmental reparations that these communities have gotten, how does that actually impact community wellness? And can we replicate that across, just not nationally here, but globally? And that's sort of the thoughts that keep me up at night. Is one, how do I get that data? How do I actually make this, design it? How do I get all the markers and the different steps to this of how do I measure it, right? Is more of what I'm thinking about it, but also how once I actually get to the point of having seen that maybe community wellness was improved after certain things got shut down, or maybe the money that they received from their environmental reparations went to a really nice park. How do I actually get that across globally? And so that's sort of a lately I've been thinking about but it's keeping me up more at night.
Got it. That was great.
Yeah, I guess I'll flip it in a different direction. It's not really keeping me up. The thing that I focus on a lot is hope. And, for me, it was very superficial for a long time. And what changed that for me, working on this project for one, but also thinking of hope as like a verb and like what I can do to help the situation. So one of the things I do, and I know that this is a little bit weird, is like I start conversations with people around what hope means to them. So like I ask family members and friends and stuff, and like, you know, I get that background. I'm not evangelical anymore, but I used to be. And like when you're at church, you talk about faith, you talk about these big ideas, like with people you don't really know that well in your community. And I think we need to do that with the word hope, with climate change, with justice, like you're trying to do. And collective discussions around those big ideas are really helpful. And so I guess like it keeps me up at night because I'm like kind of thinking about how to do that, but not in like a bad way.
Right.
That's really inspiring because it helped me think of mine. Like, I think I'm thinking a lot about this relationship between re-indigenization and care, you know, and like, you know, maybe like returning to a kind of way of thinking locally and, you know, the circles of care and what it means for us to actually care about each other and other people. I think like we have a system now that has kind of isolated us and like made it challenging to remember how do we care about other people even if they're not our families or loved ones, and what does that care look like materially, and what might happen when, you know, we return to our local economies, local ecosystems and so on, and then that care becomes necessary in order for us to actually, you know, co-thrive, co-survive, and so on.
I love that. So on that same note of care and how it relates to the ecosystem, we're going to take a quick moment of reflection with an excerpt from Afterglow. The following selection is from Broken from the Colony by Ada M. Patterson. In this story, trans girls find acceptance and security among the coral as sole survivors of a storm that submerges their Caribbean island.
The seaweed was beginning to thin above her, and the water grew shallower and shallower. She could feel the sun burning through like holes gnawed out of a rusty tin roof. Its stinging woke her up. Her body knew it was almost time. She would soon become a colony. Beneath her, the road disintegrated into sand and mud. It was much saltier up here. It all looked so murky except for the black, wet roots that tentacled the ceiling. Everything felt unstable, slippery, and dark, like she was crossing a dying mangrove. Maneuvering the brambling roots, she noted all the grief as she climbed toward the surface. Fruit trees bowed low, stripped of their bounty. Palms and pawpaw stalks swayed headless in the wheezing current. The ground beneath her, a skull of limestone, raised of any and all memory. Like no blood had ever spilled here, like no cane ever grew. Sunken out of place, everything lay damned. And with each step, the water turned hotter and greener. It was hard to move in this much heat. She could barely think. The mud was biting her heels, and all her polyps screamed into the sun. Since she, the coral, and the water were bonded by the breath, she worried the surface was still no place for girls like her. It glittered right atop her head, trembling from its own ripples. She stared upward, frozen, as if the ceiling was going to collapse, as if the sky would drop a house on her for who and what she was becoming, for who she'd always been, a girl who swam too far out, now turning to come home. Light danced on her face, and the gentlest pain fluttered across her, tingling any new corals that had begun to flower. The shape of the island was pooling through the surface. Reading the ripples, there wasn't much to look at. It was sculpt of anything she would have recognized. She could only make out some blackened, spindly trees eeling into the sky. It did look like a sea urchin, she thought, small, fragile, and protective of itself, just trying its best to survive in turbulent world. Beautiful to see and dangerous to touch. She wondered whether the island would let her hold it this time. Right beneath the surface, she continued to hesitate. She didn't know how to move, and that wasn't because of the coral. The decision to resurface was pinning her in place. Nothing here was recognizably her island. She didn't know what she was returning to. Everything was new. It had just resurfaced. And she wasn't sure if she even had the right to demand so much from this place. She didn't even know if the island could remember her. She just kept looking, not sure what to make of it. This fragile little place flickering through the unsteady window to the surface. She watched as it trembled in the play of light and water, over and over. It was dissolving, falling apart, and coming back together, like it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. The island just kept changing.
Elsewhere in the story we just heard excerpted, the author writes, "Only foundations remained, rows of concrete steps going nowhere fast, portals of memory drowned in the sea." This is a question I'll direct to all of you. How might collective memory be affected during climate change?
I mean, I think about this question from a cultural standpoint. So when you're dislocated from your space and place and all the things that make up your culture that are from that place and you have to move, I think about that a lot and what people bring that's, that it's going to keep them going. But what they left behind and lost. Like when we say that folks on the front line are losing their home, there's so much more than just like the space that they live in that they're losing. And so that piece for me is real big. Like I just can't imagine that, and more I have to, and I should, because, even though I don't have to I will have to deal with it, but I'm not on the front line. I know that folks are dealing with that daily, and yeah, that memory piece is huge. So, that's more and more why we have to fight for folks that have a voice at the table. And that's why these stories being told is like a part of that collective memory. Yeah, I guess I'll stop there.
Any other takes?
I guess just to maybe build on what Tori shared, and in relationship to that particular story, because it's talking about the Caribbean, like where I come from. And a few years ago, like my father on his island experienced a hurricane that removed his roof, and he was just kind of sleeping, in that house with no roof for a few days. I think the memories that people who experience things like that will share and bring to that conversation is how to survive and what community looks like, and what it's like to feed each other and take care of each other and share, and I'm thinking of places, where our fruit trees, and we gather the fruit, and then we either make bags of mangoes and put them on the wall, and whoever wants to take them can take them. So almost like technologies of care and community, and what those were like at home. Those are other kinds of stories we share even now about what it was like at home to feel really connected to people that you live around and nearby, and how we take care of each other when there's a hurricane or a flood or what have you, and how that can add to the broader shared story and shared memory of the places that we come to and travel to.
And when you say about technologies of care, I love that phrase, and also with the anecdote about the mangoes. I'm wondering, for as long as you've been doing this work, what are certain ways that we can intensify our care technologies? Like if we live in the city, what are ways that we can just perhaps reconsider our day to help someone else?
Look at each other.
Look at each other.
Acknowledge people when we're passing by. I know that's hard in New York, but it happens sometimes in Brooklyn. I think the community fridges that came up during pandemic, example of that. I think that was the intention of those folks, and seeing those actually as microcosms of those systems of care that actually always existed, like soup kitchens and food pantries and so on. I think it's like seeing those things, you know, and thinking about how that can be expanded. Yeah, and thinking about relating to people instead of institutions. I think it's really easy to relate to like stores, businesses, you know, especially in our neighborhoods. But what about like those people, you know, like, you know, especially small business owners and so on.
I think about, this is going to Yoshi, but about how the data takes years to sort of, I guess, collect. I don't know the scientific words, but thinking about oral histories too. Can you riff off of that a little bit? Like, how does it, when trying to get the scientific data of climate change, but then you have the oral histories that are happening so much more immediately, how do they collide with each other or maybe work with each other?
Yeah, so no, my head went to oral histories and like ethnographic research and what we call qualitative research, so like interviews or focus groups when your question about collective and community care came about. But I see those going hand in hand. And so one of the phrases that we like to throw around is like mixed methods. And that just really means, you know, both what we would call qualitative focus groups, interviews, and quantitative would be more data, like how many emergency visits after hurricane or heat waves, et cetera. But I do see them, I think particularly, they're very powerful in oral histories and preserving the whys, right? Or the feelings, stuff that you can't necessarily measure with any just like a survey or some of these other what they call objective measures. And so I do emphasize like oral histories are that is research, right? That is science. It's more on the social science, but it is very much valid, and that I think helps preserve a lot of what we can't capture in some of these other forms of our scientific inquiry, and do go feed into both like fiction and nonfiction stories, right? Because if you think about some of the, I think about some of my friends that did get, had to then abandon Puerto Rico after the hurricanes and had to complete their dissertation studies elsewhere. You know, just to think about all the, one, having to uproot, but then two, having to still complete. And a lot of those experiences that ended up feeding their line of research and their line of work.
Yeah, for sure. Tori, we know that you love talking about hope. That's what keeps you up at night. But what if you come across someone who's like, we should not be talking about hope. We're in a climate, like the urgency of today's climate crisis. Like, what would you say to counter that?
Yeah, I wouldn't really counter it. Like, I want people to feel their feelings. So if they're feeling that in that moment, then, you know, really, like, it's a pretty tough thing that we're in. People are talking about tipping points. That brings up a lot of climate anxiety that folks have. And so I'm really big on people kind of, like, I have children. So feel your feelings. And then I would talk about how I'm feeling about the situation. And if at that moment I'm feeling hopeful, or I could, like, lend them a resource that is a little bit more hopeful about, like, what's going on, I think that would be a way. I wouldn't really try to argue with someone who's like having an emotional feeling to like something that's real in the world. But I want to touch on this idea of you know, care work, because it shows up in our stories a lot. And I think the NAP ministries and healing justice, like flowing into the climate movement and climate storytelling, is a net positive in so many ways. The stories that we get have aspects that I just wouldn't have thought of. We have a really beautiful story by author Rich Larson, and I'm forgetting the name of the story, but it's about a grandmother who has indigenous wisdom, and there's a scientist who's working to find a way to keep the lights on that is through bioluminescence. And the grandmother is trying to tell her, but she doesn't have time for the grandmother, and the grandmother's also like on her way out, and she doesn't give her the time, but then she finally listens, you know, instead of just being like rushing and like, I got to get to my work. And when she listens, the grandmother has the indigenous knowledge that she's been looking for. So it's about that intergenerational care. You know, obviously when her grandmother passes, she misses her. So I should have listened. I should have, you know, so that, you know, talking about that care work, I think, that's what excites me about this project is like, of course I'm, interested from the climate aspect, but we have to meet people where they are. And so the other aspects that help get people there and that are intertwined and a part of our life are really important. It's like the care work is showing up in a lot of the stories.
Right. Leading into our next story, I wanted to ask, when it comes to community, meaning we have to work together, think about technologies of care, and making space for everyone's feelings. Like, how do we also make sure we make room for our imagination when survival can be so precarious? That was very distinct. I like that.
You want to go?
I was still thinking about how are you getting more of like how do we like self-care or? Because
self-care can have so many different meanings. Like, I mean, just like imagining the future when it feels like the survival these days can be such on shaky ground. How do you keep imagining or keep hoping too? That can be a form of imagination.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's a difficult question, but I think it's one of those where I think any of us on the stage and probably in the audience, like that is something that I guess we are all hopeful for, right? That things are going to change, but at the same time, we are still the change makers. And so that is sort of like making sure that you have both like what can I do now to make it better? What can I do now to take care of people? But also how are these steps, however small you think they might be, actually do have these ripple effects, right? And so that's sort of where I guess my head goes in terms of like imagining how my work is going to be or how my work will hopefully shape the future, right? And so that's what I'm like imagining,
right?
And I do in particularly I'll tie it back to some of my work on environmental justice. Like we spend a lot of time talking about environmental justice, but really we refer to environmental injustice because it's these communities that live at the front lines are disproportionate by pollution, and what we want with them is environmental justice. We've been dreaming about this for like 30 years, right? More than 30 years. The fight is still continuing. We haven't lost it. We've made like gains, right? But we do envision and imagine that everybody will have clean air, clean water, that they'll be able to live on a house that is going to be taking care of them, right? That they're not only providing for them, but they're providing for their families, their neighbors. And so that's sort of what is the vision to keep the work going. Because without it, I think any of us could probably be doing something completely different. But we choose to do this area of work that does take a lot of creativity to move it forward.
Yeah. Any remarks there?
Yeah, and I'll just say like the speculative aspect of the project and just people dreaming in that way, I think you can look at it as helping in looking at how is the world going to be in 180 years. But when you do that, it allows people to kind of remove themselves from the current situation and sometimes apply those things in like 3 years. Like some of the lessons that are in these stories are about how we interact with each other. We don't have to wait 180 years for that to happen. So like that capacity and like the dreams and imaginations that people conjure up, I think you could do this, and this is what I've learned from you, is that Aisha's done this like with policy folks. Like you can do this not just with like speculative fiction can help folks in like policy, politics, public health, like that idea of dreaming and collectively thinking outside of like the fish tank that you're in. You can pop off new and imagine new ideas, I guess, and then it's funny, you just don't use those ideas like for 180 years. You can like use them now because they're about interpersonal relationships. A lot of it, not always.
I would just add that I think about my ancestors and everything that kind of hope that they had to have so that I could be here. And then I'm like, okay, like relatively speaking, like my life's kind of like, like I could have a little bit more hope for like my descendants.
Love it. We'd love to close out this portion of our event with a final reading of Afterglow from Eric Lockley. The following selection is from the Cloud Weaver song by Sal Tanpepper. In a city high above the desert, a dew harvester and her friend sacrifice everything to prove the end of the great drying is at hand.
Shh, she is asleep, Abolimi whispers. I kiss my precious daughter on the cheek, and she doesn't even stir, for she is exhausted from her hard work. I know that when she harvests the crops each day, she looks to the skies and thinks that what we are doing here on the ground is not so exhilarating. She takes after her brother in that way. Someday she will stay awake long enough to hear the story to its completion. Maybe it'll be tomorrow, or perhaps next year. Maybe it will even be before the sky people's cisterns empty for good, and they realize the great drying is finally over. Then they too will come down from the towers, and she will understand that this is the day for which we have been preparing. It is why I don my skin each night and weave my webs in clouds that no longer form so high in the sky. We need the rain, but so does the earth. Ready, Simar? My dear Sibai Alimara asks, as he finishes checking my harness. I eagerly nod, for the mists are already forming, and they look to be especially thick tonight. Sleep well, my children, I whisper, and dream of the weaver's song. For tonight, the wires will sing with joy.
Thank you to Tori, Yoshi, and Eric so much for this vibrant discussion and for those compelling readings from Afterglow. We're going to move into the final portion of our event tonight, where we'll be inviting our audience, both at home and here in person, to envision a more hopeful climate future for our communities. For this, I'm going to turn things over to Aisha.
Hi, everyone. I know we've been sitting for a while, so I want to invite folks to just do whatever fidgeting you need to do to get comfortable, change position, reacquaint yourself with your bodies. So, how many people have the book already? Awesome, and then there'll be a lot more people who will have the book before we leave tonight, I'm sure. But so the book is called Afterglow, Climate Fiction for Future Ancestors. And we might be asking ourselves, what does it mean to be a future ancestor? What is that? So one of the ways in which I think about being a future ancestor is thinking about our sacred responsibility. And one of the sacred responsibilities of future ancestors, like the authors actually of the stories in Afterglow, is to do our best to imagine future worlds in which our descendants, many generations from now, are thriving. And then do our best to make those future worlds possible. So we talked a little bit about how we do that, and we'll talk about it a little bit more now. How do we make sure that those future worlds that we imagine actually become possible? How do we cultivate a practice of imagining and shaping the future? So at my creative studio, we do this using Worldbuilding. And in Worldbuilding, as I mentioned, we cast our sights to the future or to an alternative reality to create a fictional story world that articulates the values, the rituals, the ceremonies, the ways of life, the worldviews, the structures and systems of a world that we desire. And it's really important that we come from a place of desire, a little bit less than intellect when it comes to the future. So world building and imagining this world we desire actually allows us, as Tori mentioned, to temporarily suspend the reality of most of the obstacles that we face currently so that we can identify potential core practices and experiments that we can implement right now. So when we're doing world building, we ask ourselves, what if and why not? So we're going to go into a short guided world building experience so that you too can have the opportunity to create worlds and stories that actually make climate resilient futures and the path towards them irresistible and hopefully inevitable. So we're going to start with a few deep breaths. And we breathe, at least in my practice, we breathe at the beginning of world building and imagining, because we want to understand that imagination is not an intellectual exercise. It's actually a fully embodied, if not spiritual practice, whereby we allow our minds to travel beyond our current material reality. And so to make that easier, we found that entering our breath and increasing our awareness can help in deepening our ability to imagine, especially things that don't yet exist. So we'll take 3 deep breaths together. Breathe in and release. Breathe in again and release. And we'll breathe in one more time. And release. You can actually continue to breathe at your own pace. And as we breathe, I want us to imagine that you are able to travel to a land that you love deeply. So bring to mind a place that you have a lot of affection for, a lot of love for, a place that carries a lot of beautiful and good memories, a place that you feel connected to, and a place that you feel loved by. Maybe it's a land that has shaped you and who you are. And as you bring to mind an image or a memory from this land, I want to first invite you to send some gratitude to the ancestors of that land, the people who stewarded that land before you arrived at it in a way that allowed you to enjoy it. So just take a few moments to bring that land, that place, that space to mind, to your heart. And send gratitude to the ancestors of that land, whether you know exactly who they are or not. Because most certainly, the fact that you were able to experience joy and love and beauty on that land was because of their stewarding of it in some way. And now I want to invite you to imagine arriving at that land in the year 2200, 177 years from now. I invite you to imagine that you find that as you arrive in this place that you love, 177 years from now, that there are still people there, and they are thriving, and they are living in an equally thriving ecosystem. So as you arrive into that future land with thriving people and thriving ecosystems, take a few minutes to take it all in. And for the next couple of invitations, I invite you to use your notebooks to record your thoughts or what you're seeing. And in your notebooks, if you feel called, just write down what's the name of the land that you chose to visit. What was its name when you were in relationship to it? And what might be its name in the year 2200? And if we have the first prompt, we can bring it up now. But in the year 2200, when people are living in thriving, climate-resilient ecosystems on that land, what do you see? What does that ecosystem look like? What do you smell? What do you hear? What do you feel? Who is on that land and what are they doing? Just take a couple minutes to write down what you're seeing, what you're feeling, what you're hearing, who you see there. And as you observe this land in the year 2200, what values do you see shaping the ways of life in that community, on that land? What shared practices are making it possible for everyone to thrive? What structures or systems exist to make this thriving possible? Take a couple moments to imagine what life is like, how people are interacting. What values do you see in practice? And what structures or systems embody those values? And as you wrap up that thought, I want to invite you to turn to someone next to you. Take a couple moments to find someone who wants to create some story together with you. Because these are we questions. So as you turn to your neighbor, the questions I want to invite you to discuss are: what did we do differently now as future ancestors to make that land or that world, that ecosystem, possible for our descendants to thrive within? What leaps did we make? And leaps are like things you kind of have a hunch we need to try, but maybe we think they're kind of difficult, so huge transformations. So if there's something you already have in mind, a huge transformation, something that seems impossible, imagine for a moment it's possible. There's no restrictions, there's no obstacle, there's nothing in the way. What leaps did we make? And as you're discussing with your neighbor, what role did you play in that leap? What gift of yours did you offer? How did you choose to step into your leadership as a future ancestor? So we are actually going to talk to our neighbors. So you're going to have about 4 minutes to have that conversation, and I'll repeat the questions. What did we do differently in this time as future ancestors to make it possible for our descendants to thrive in 2200? What big leaps or transformations did we make? And what role did you play? We have about 30 more seconds, 30 more seconds. All right, let's bring it back together just for a couple seconds. You're gonna get to continue talking to your neighbors, but I'm gonna add a couple more questions. In this beautiful conversation that you're having, I want to invite you to reflect on what practices or artifacts, so what evidence of 2200 or the path towards it would you want to bring back to this time so that we could make that future real? So what practices, what artifacts, what evidence, if you could go to 2200, observe that climate resilient future and bring something back, some lesson from that future that we can use and start to implement now, what would it be? So you have about 4 minutes to chat about that. love to hear from a few people, if anyone's willing to share. If not, I have a couple of names I can call on. Would anyone like to share? Yes. Good. Do we have a floor mic?
Oh, okay. I guess I'll be first. So sharing the future that we were talking about?
Yeah, like a practice or an artifact or anything from your experience.
Yeah. So it was kind of like chilling in a good way because like our visions were like pretty much aligned and specifically thinking about tending the places where saltwater meets freshwater. So the estuaries. I was thinking of one in my hometown in Stockton called the San Joaquin River. And I imagined that place transforming in 2100 to not be called the San Joaquin River, but named Diadrome Waterway. I don't know why. Well, I do know. Diadromist is a descriptor for species that can migrate between salt and freshwater. But an artifact that I thought to bring back, there's two. Well, you helped me inspire one of them. One was just bringing back a salmon that, because the waterway was healed, salmon have started to flourish in the river over the period of many years, and they're really vibrant and have like different colored scales. I got into the radical imagination. I was like, dang, this is a rainbow salmon, queer as hell. And then I also got, we were thinking a lot about like place-based specific healing. So that river was worked on with Filipino-Mexican farm workers. And so also bringing back like this pre-colonial Filipino like banca, which is like a canoe, as a sort of a practice that of people reconnecting to their cultures and recognizing the interconnection through water, because that freshwater river meets the ocean, and seeing that relationship even back to our homelands, but also having a very specific relationship to that river because of farm working. So that connection.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Ryan.
Yeah, I can just go to keep the saltwater, freshwater node. One thing I thought about was just how many creation stories treat that as a sacred, potent place. Like one of the earliest creation stories, there's a goddess of saltwater who makes love with a god of freshwater, and they create the world together. And so the artifact that I was asking myself and wanting to bring back is, what would be the myth or the myths that people in 2200 would use and live under and use to sort of imagine the forces around us to create this interconnected, more caring, ecologically whole and vibrant world.
That's beautiful. Thank you.
So we both did ski resorts, which is less odd because we're related. So different resorts. But we both shared that mass transportation was a big thing. Both of the resorts are accessed by a long car ride, and there are some buses, but there's not a train or any, really eco-friendly way of getting in. And then the waste of energy that could be reused in many other ways that come with the mountains and the nature and the resort that's part of it. I think both of them carried the same values in the future of how forever everybody appreciates those mountains and being in the mountains and being outside. And so they still appreciated the mountains then, but were able to capture more of the wasted energy and be more collective together on sharing resources and living together.
Wow, that's beautiful. Thank you. I think we have time for one more.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to bias the front line.
Pardon then, I'll be brief. We were talking about, we were envisioning a community that was, co-residential and had shared land and all kinds of collaboration. And rather than thinking about all the technology of that or the policy of that or any of these big things, we were trying to think about what kinds of rituals and what kinds of names could we bring back from the future to describe the kinds of relationships that would exist in a place like this, that would support a place like this. Because sometimes not having the names for things makes it hard to make them real. And when we try to do that now, we've run into a lot of obstacles trying to make those things real with folks who don't have the story. So we were thinking about like what kinds of rituals could be created around, you know, co-parenting systems that are raising children with more people involved. And what kinds of rituals could be involved in mentorship or in working together as teams, rather than having all these like kinds of language that are very jargony. You know, what could we call these things that would create rituals that we participate in that make us believe in them and care about them more? And how could we bring that forward into the future from here?
That's so beautiful. Thank you. I really want to hear all of them because I'm feeling so inspired by just these like practices and also like the stories of the lands that y'all are connected to. And we are out of time. So the invitation is to continue building those worlds and to go deeper with them, flesh them out, make them beautiful, and maybe to go the other step, which is to start to create stories, like find a specific person, like imagine like a future descendant, and, you know, to emphasize a descendant is not just, you know, your blood descendant, it's somebody who's gonna live on the land because you made it possible for them to do so. By your actions now. So to write a story about that person and what a day in their life would be like, and use that world building and that storytelling to glean more of these practices and then bring them back to now, and, you know, go back to your folks, your people, and start to try some of these things, or to, you know, to tell the story about some of these ideas. And we really also wanted folks to return to the notebook. So one idea that we have is like, maybe you could return to the notebook once a month and kind of like check in on your story and be like, is there anything else I want to add to it? Maybe you want to finish it, you know, over the next few months and then go to a bigger book or what have you. But continue to tell that story and let those stories and those worlds infuse the work that you're doing right now. Thank you all for imagining together with us. And I'll hand it back to Diana.
Thank you all so much for being here tonight, for participating in this little thing that we put together. I want to thank Science Friday for letting me do this work, and for all of my colleagues who support this work. Our friends at Grist, who partnered with us to make this amazing event tonight. The Green Space, who hosted us and let us do all of this stuff together. And of course, our sponsor for tonight, the Marine Stewardship Council, for just supporting this work because they think it's great. I want to thank all of you for doing it, the activity tonight, and for taking time, if you were here with us in person, out of your very busy schedule, as well as on a really rainy night that really didn't want you to come out, but you did. So thank you very much. Have a good night. Stay safe.